Are you ready to accept the Dine and Discover Marana Local Summer Challenge? Support local food and beverage businesses, including restaurants, cafes, food trucks, and more. Track your trips on the challenge card and visit the Marana Visitor Center to earn exclusive Marana merch you'll be proud to wear. What better way to show community pride and support for local businesses? For more information, visit discovermarana.org. Challenge cards will be accepted through August or while supplies last. This program is brought to you by the Marana Chamber of Commerce in partnership with Discover Marana.
People lose their valuables every day simply because they forget to lock their car doors. Don't be another statistic. Remove all your belongings anytime you leave your car, including valuables and weapons. This is a message from the Marana Police Department, reminding all residents to lock it or lose it.
Welcome to Real Talk with the Town, where I sit down with the Marana staff to answer your burning questions about our beautiful community. My name is Terry Rozema, and I'm the town manager for the town, so let's get started. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Real Talk with the Town. My name is Terry, and I am your host, and today we have with us a very special guest, somebody from outside the organization, somebody who specializes in restaurants, owns a few of them himself, has been in the restaurant business since he was like 14. I think he's now like 25 maybe, but he said he's been doing this for 30-some years. So, Grant, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Good afternoon, Terry. Really excited to be here today with you guys. My name is Grant Krueger. I'm the owner and operator of Union Hospitality Group. We currently own Union Public House, Reforma Modern Mexican Mezcal and Tequila, Proof Artisanal Pizza and Pasta, all located in St. Philip's Plaza at River and Campbell in Tucson. And I'm also the owner and operator of the Maverick, King of Clubs, at Grant and Tango Verde.
All right, so two very popular areas, St. Philip's Plaza and the Maverick, really wonderful places. And again, Grant, I just want to thank you. And we did establish, I just want the readers or the listeners to know that we did establish before the show that Grant does not have a brother named Freddie, so we're very grateful for that. And
it is true. Thank you. I take that razzing every once in a while there since grade school.
Grade school, yeah, okay. For those who don't know, Freddie Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street. Nightmare on Elm Street, I think, is where that's from. But hey, we're not here to talk about scary movies. We're here to talk about restaurants, and this is a big deal for the town of Marana. And so I'm going to read just a few things that came in from some of our listeners, their thoughts on this whole restaurant thing. And I want you to kind of set us straight, if you will, Grant. So
you got it. Happy to help.
Outstanding. So just kind of keep these things in the back of your mind. We're not going to go through these one by one, but this is just kind of sets the stage for some of the comments and remarks that we're hearing from our community. Why is it easier for fast food restaurants to open? Another quote unquote, another fast food restaurant, ! Right? So we've got too many of those, people believe. And I would probably be in that camp. But why is the town interfering with the free market? If there is demand, then the locally owned restaurant will come. Okay? So there's somebody who understands economics, to a certain degree anyway. And then please stop with the calls for chain restaurants. The town should be small business friendly. And then the last one, instead of fast food and chain restaurants, focus on locally owned establishments. All right. So as Grant said, he is the owner of Union Hospitality Group and has been in the restaurant business for a very long time, 33 years, I think you said?
Yes, sir, Terry. Started at the absolute bottom as a dishwasher, washing dishes and bussing tables. And I think to this day, 33 years later, I still wash dishes and bus tables. I just do it on a slightly larger scale.
I love it, Grant. And what a great success story, man, to be able to go from a 14-year-old dishwasher to owning 3 different restaurants, to owning a bar, the Maverick. Great success story. And that's why we had you on the show. We're having you on the show because we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago to kind of talk about what we can do, because we started this restaurant recruitment task force, and some people think we're crazy for doing this. So I want to get your thoughts on that right off the bat. You know, is this a dumb idea for us to have a restaurant recruitment task force?
First and foremost, I think it's pretty flattering to have a restaurant recruitment task force. I'm not so sure I've ever heard of an elite fighting force like this. Right. I'd like to see what the makeup is of this force over here and the requirements.
And it's a task force. It's not a committee, right? Committees talk about doing stuff, but we're a task force, man. We're mission driven. We're going to go out there. We're going to hunt you guys down, and we're going to beg and plead you to come plant your flag in our community.
Well, it's very flattering, first and foremost, to see everybody looking for locally owned. It's one of the things I love about doing business in Southern Arizona is there is really an attachment to locally owned, right? Like there's something to be said about seeing the proprietor in your favorite establishment and having that name recognition that can be developed in local establishments that just won't ever necessarily happen in a chain restaurant.
Yeah. Great point. So let's talk a little bit about why. So why hasn't Grant Krueger done essentially what he's done down at St. Philip's Plaza, which is amazing. I love going down there. I love it when you have the bands out there and you can sit out there in the open space and you can walk around with a beer and, just have a good time. So why hasn't Grant Krueger done something like that here in Marana?
Well, first and foremost, Marana's a pretty young community. And as you guys have noticed over the last few years, there was this minor detail that severely affected the restaurant business, this whole pandemic thing. And it kind of turned our industry on its ear. It was one that an industry that was having some problems to begin with wages, right? Like minimum wage in the state of Arizona has moved up since 2016, since the passage of Proposition 206. To where we now have the 8th highest minimum wage in the United States and the 6th highest tip wage, right? And that tip wage is the wage for servers. The minimum wage currently in Arizona is $13.85 an hour. Servers and bartenders, bussers, hostesses, predominantly tip positions make $10.85 an hour. But with servers making $10.85 an hour plus tips, it turns to quite a substantial amount. But it also is a lot more expensive for the restaurateur to run restaurants like this anymore. The larger surface area, the more square footage you have to cover, the more servers you need to have, right? And as such, it's now 5 times as expensive to build a restaurant with a dining room and staff it in Arizona than it is Texas, who still has a $2.13 server minimum wage. So there's kind of a war on full service as we know it. And it isn't because the restaurant groups don't want to do it, it's that it's hard to afford to do it anymore. How many places do you walk into, even fast food, where you're no longer greeted by a human being? It's an iPad. And you're seeing reductions in square footage from the industry across the board. We've got 3 of the 4 restaurants that we operate in our group are 7,000 square feet above. And these are essentially dinosaurs, Terry. Like
those are big facilities.
People aren't building restaurants like that anymore. Even the chains have moved their size from 7,000, 8,000 or these 10,000 square foot steakhouses down to 4,500, 5,000 square foot restaurants. And I think that's also creates one of the problems that you guys are experiencing here in Marana right now is you've got an industry that already was kind of having a bad day with the way minimum wage was moving. And then you add in the pandemic where, employee problems were exacerbated to levels we would have never expected. And then add a sprinkling in of supply chain issues and cost increases and inflation. And suddenly you've got a perfect storm that makes the environmental conditions for the creation of new restaurants very difficult.
So you are identifying just one, I don't want to say obstacle, one challenge. Let's use that word. One challenge after another that a locally owned restaurant is going to face if they want to open up a new restaurant here in Marana. So let me ask you this. The Restaurant Recruitment Task Force, are we spinning our wheels, by sitting down with the Grant Krugers of the world and the Ari's Collective and the Sam Foxes? Are we spinning our wheels here? And is this listener who says, why is the town interfering with the free market? Why are you going through all this effort? Are we spinning our wheels by doing this? I don't
think so. This is my first time setting foot in the Marana Municipal Complex. And so just to see the development that you guys have out here is eye-opening for me. And so I think it is a worthwhile thing to make sure that everybody knows that Marana is growing and is business friendly. And I think creating something like a task force shows that.
Well, we're listening to the people of our community. I have roughly 1,300, close to 1,300 surveys from our residents. Oh, it says right at the top, 1,275 surveys from our community in just a little over 2 weeks. People who say, hey, we want restaurants and this is what we want to see. And locally owned is one of the things that is repeated in here over and over and over again. But it sounds like that's a challenge. So if that is a challenge, what advice do you have for us, and what kinds of things can you tell some of the listeners who think it's just, Town of Marana, go out and get some locally owned restaurants and have them build here? I mean, what kind of...
First and foremost, I think the environmental conditions are tough. That even in a perfect world, if COVID hadn't existed, I think you're going to see less and less full-service sit-down restaurants. The legacy stores will continue. The investment's already made. It's a sunk cost. We're not going to tear down the restaurants in St. Phil's Plaza just because nobody would build them that size anymore, right? We're going to operate them until it's just no longer economically feasible to do so. But you're not going to see a lot of creation of new ones of that nature. And I think because we've got a lot of new building in Marana, where your opportunities may lie here would be in relaxed municipal codes or perhaps incentives actually on the landlord side. One of the things that we didn't discuss yet today, and maybe only marginally touched on when we first met, was the idea that most restaurateurs aren't, especially locally owned guys, aren't walking in and buying a piece of dirt and erecting a brand new build-to-suit restaurant in the tune of many millions of dollars. Like to build a restaurant like a Union or a Reforma or something, like these aren't like $50,000 restaurants. I've got a flooring budget that's twice that. These are like multi-million dollar build-outs. And so by the time you get into the cost of real estate acquisition and construction, the time value of your money, very few restaurateurs that actually have the skill set to make you an amazing bolognese or make an amazing cocktail menu. That's not even necessarily the same guy or girl that has the real estate skill set to construct. And for a restaurateur, our highest and best use of our capital, if you have that much capital, would be to build 5 or 6 restaurants with that same money that you were renting and not tie up your money into the real estate, but instead go multi-unit, which is, you mentioned the Fox Restaurant Corporation model. This is sort of what they do, right? They actually build now and then sell off their restaurants. They no longer own the building. They become their own tenant with favorable lease terms negotiated by them at the sale, and then backed by the guarantee of a strong restaurant corporation behind them that they don't have to personally guarantee. And suddenly, they're in a favorable position for this. But it takes huge equity groups like that, right, that are worth, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars or more. When you look into the kind of chains that you're getting now, Darden Restaurant Corporation places, these are billion-dollar corporations. Like these are major.
Yeah. So give some examples of Darden restaurants. So what are some of the chains that are in Darden?
So the most current ones that you would know, of course, would be like Olive Garden. Yard House is like a big pub concept they do.
Okay.
They were Red Lobster for many years. They spun that one off a few years back. But these are like major chains to where it's the same menu in every single store across the towns, or across the nation, similar price points across the nation, and they tend to make their food in commissary kitchens. Commissary is essentially...
Yeah, I want to hear you talk a little bit about that. So the difference between, a place like what you operate, and we talked about one of the ones that's really popular in the list here is Cheddar's. I've never even been to a Cheddar's, but, scratch food preparation versus the commissary type of... let's talk about that.
So when you're a nationwide chain of anything, what's almost more important than being good is being consistent. Right? You think about why McDonald's is successful, right? Here's a restaurant group with, 50,000 units across the world. And I can't find one individual over the age of 10 that would actually tell me that McDonald's hamburger is the best hamburger they've ever had. How is it that not one person could say it's the best hamburger ever, and yet it's the most successful restaurant in the history of the world?
Right.
We were talking about a mediocre product that we could all agree is mediocre. We didn't say terrible, right? It's a 6 or 7 out of 10, Terry, but every single time. No matter where you're traveling in the world, you know what a McDonald's is going to look like and feel like. You know what a number one combo, is where it's going to be on the menu and what the color palette of the restaurant is going to be. And people like that same way they love a local restaurant because of the familiarity and, that local recognition. Well, these chains can provide that for people too, particularly as you travel throughout the country. Do you pick, Bob's Cafe somewhere, or is it just McDonald's for breakfast because you know exactly what you're going to get? That Egg McMuffin may not be great, but it also isn't going to be a 2 out of 10 almost ever, right? It's going to be consistently mediocre. And so the chains do this as well too. They make their food in large off-site kitchens far away from the restaurant, often in other parts of the country. And everything is IQF, like a quick freezing process, so that when it makes its way to the restaurant, they're not really doing real cooking, right? They're not baking bread from scratch. They're not making pasta. In most cases, they're not.
And do you guys do that?
Yes, very much so. We're
baking your own bread.
Very much so, yeah. We're gluttons for punishment. It's a pretty unusual thing. I would say most places don't.
Yeah, that's a lot.
You mentioned Aries Collective, right? Nate Aries, a good friend of mine and neighbor as well, too. And they do their own baking program as well. But we're kind of the last of the Mohicans. It's a pretty laborious process. And a very specialized skill set. And you have to have some scale to do it, too. We're lucky that we have a few restaurants that we can do it with. And then kind of commissary, but on a much smaller local level, to our own stores.
Right.
Generally, you wouldn't build a bake shop for just one restaurant inside that restaurant. You'd build a bake shop and then spread it to 2 or 3 or 4, or use those goods in a few different manners so that every place can kind of claim fresh baked bread, but it just might not all be baked on site at that exact the same place where it's consumed, if that makes sense. But ultimately, the chains use these big commissary kitchens for consistency's sake.
Let's go to the movies. Marana Parks and Recreation presents the free Movies in Marana series on scheduled Saturdays between April and October. Movies start at sundown. Food vendors will be on site. Don't forget to bring chairs and a blanket. Visit maranaaz.gov/movies for the complete schedule.
Whether you're starting a business or looking to expand in Marana, our Town Development Services staff will walk you through the steps towards success. Learn about business licenses, development permits, business loans, local and state resources, and more. Let's get to work. For more information, visit maranaaz.gov/business development.
Why would you want to work for the Town of Marana? Well, let's hear what our employees have to say.
I feel like working for the Town of Marana makes you feel like a person, not a number.
I really wanted to work for the community where I lived.
I have children that play in the parks.
Working for a public entity, it's kind of a sacred trust. I like that. It's an honor to serve.
The town's mission is to provide 5-star service for a thriving community.
To me, 5-star service comes from within. It's a drive to make your surroundings a better place.
Providing community service like the Founders Day Parade, the swim lessons, clean drinking water.
Of course, the benefits are great.
I get sent to seminars and conferences, and
Town of Marana compensates vacation.
We do have an amazing gym facility, alternate schedules as well. Our employees are also able to telework.
My supervisor in particular really cares about our work-life balance.
My colleagues are fun. It's just a fun place to work.
We have a culture of friendship.
The people in general that work here and apply here all want to make a difference in their everyday life for themselves and for the community.
Let's make an impact on our community. Visit maranaaz.gov/careers and apply now.
You step into a big chain restaurant, and rather than having a load of grills and flat tops and deep fryers, there will literally be a bank of freezers and microwaves and combi ovens because they're rethermalizing and reheating product. And most people don't realize that. And I love that we do have a real connection with local flavor in the Tucson metro area, right? It kind of starts with a love of Mexican food, and you've had the City of Gastronomy designation that got bestowed upon Tucson from UNESCO, and a history of great Mexican restaurants. But in general, we've had a history of great sole proprietorships.
So tell me the downside of what it is you do. Because you're making stuff from scratch, and like you said, you got human beings in there making the bread and grinding the beef and doing all that stuff. So what's the potential downside there?
So the downside is, of course, variation to begin with, right? Like when you make something fresh every single day, made by a human being, well, human beings have different feelings, emotions, stresses, right? Sometimes, like, although we try to have as consistent of recipes as possible, there's just variation in product. Getting into, we talked about bread, in the environmental conditions in baking bread change nearly daily. And so depending on the relative humidity in the air, the leavening of that dough can happen at different times. And so you just can't sit there with a timer and say you must wait X number of hours. It's actually, there's a bit of look and feel and touch to it that's like a skill set. We've had, labor shortages that have made things tough, and it's forced us to put people in positions sometimes that they weren't necessarily ready yet for. Maybe none of the listeners think of restaurant business as a skill job, but it truly is. Not only do you need to manage the general public well, right? Have the gift of gab and be able to be hospitable towards everybody under any circumstance. You also have to know an awful lot about food and food safety. And so, like, having those two unique skill sets together, like to where you're asking a server who's 19 years old to be able to not just tell you the difference between a Pinot Noir and a Pinot Grigio, but I also want her to wax eloquently about single malt Scotch. But wait a minute, I also want you to be a certified dietitian with malpractice insurance because I'm allergic to gluten, onions, flour, water, and air. So go. What's for dinner today? And so tell me that that's not a skill.
Yeah, that is a skill. And I have to tell you, so we talked a little bit about this. Would you say that people in general, the public in general, are pretty gracious when it comes to they get a bad meal or they get a bad drink? How do they typically respond to that? Because I want our listeners to kind of, I think you're given like a really great understanding of just how complicated and difficult it can be to run a restaurant and to have the kind of consistency, do things from scratch, or even if you're not doing it from scratch, it can be really difficult. So how in general do you see the public responding to a bad day from a chef or from a wait staff?
Everybody's a reviewer.
Right.
Everybody's a critic.
Yeah.
And while on one level the data is amazing because the feedback can be very helpful. Maybe this house cocktail that you just thought was the bee's knees was actually not a real winner, right? And so on and so forth. But many times too, it can be very difficult because once in a while you're going to have an experience that doesn't meet your expectations. And often they're met with like such anger and vitriol to where the guest will say, I am never returning here. I am so insulted that this experience was so poor. And I think to myself, like, gosh, like waiting an extra 5 or 10 minutes at like a Home Depot or Lowe's happens to me all the time. And I never storm out of there and say, I will never set foot in Ace Hardware ever again, right? Like, I just wouldn't do that kind of thing. I wouldn't think that poor experience would necessarily cause me to write off the establishment in perpetuity.
So a little grace goes a long way, right?
I like to think so.
Yeah.
And I think that, honestly, like we know as a restaurant group, we are imperfect. Our job to provide perfect customer service is an impossibility in reality. We're only going to ever hit in like the high 90s in that on our best day. And so we try to own our mistakes and to take good care of the guests who have a rough experience and make it great for them so that hopefully they come back.
Yeah, outstanding. So I want to talk a little bit here about your opinion. And I get it, it's your opinion, but it's an expert opinion, right? And so I've got 1,275 experts right here.
Excellent. I'll read through them. This sounds like Friday night for me.
These people have all their ideas here about what they want to see here in the town of Marana and what they think will be successful. And I think there's a lot of great ideas here, but I'd like to hear from you. What do you think would, where the town needs to start and what's going to be successful to kind of get the ball rolling, like up in this northern part, essentially from Twin Peaks to the north for us?
First and foremost, like kudos to you guys for being proactive, for going out and seeking this sort of information and feedback from local restaurateurs. As I think ultimately to get the ball rolling over here, you're going to need to have real estate properties that are sufficient for restaurant use, right? Both in size, both in terms of infrastructure, right? The mechanical units, the kind of AC you might need to put into a retail store might be woefully underpowered to run a restaurant. Plumbing installations as well, like grease traps and the requirements for these big, new, massive grease traps that...
Talk about that for a second, because you explained that to me a couple of weeks ago, And I was blown away at the expense of it, the size of it. I mean, just incredible.
It's all part of why these restaurant build-outs end up being multi-million-dollar build-outs. Well, imagine making a couple thousand meals a night. Well, that's an awful lot of grease. We just can't dump that into the sanitary sewer system for a whole host of reasons.
And our wastewater folks are greatly appreciative for folks who don't do that. So
very much so.
yeah.
Oh, they actually come out and test us. They put in like non-soluble fatty acids with dye in them and then test it further downstream after running it down your drain to make sure that your grease collection units are doing their job efficiently. Many years ago, you could get by on a restaurant in our size, like when we took over from the old Acacia space and turned it into Union Public House, that had a 100-gallon grease trap, right? Which is a pretty sizable unit. Think of it as like the size of maybe, 8 or 10 like Yeti coolers, like the size of a refrigerator or something underground, right? Maybe it'd be like to give you an idea. Well, that same existing restaurant, when I went to go get a new permit, right, from the health department and from Pima County to get a certificate of occupancy, they said, yeah, just because Acacia was there a few months ago, that old grease trap's not going to work anymore. This is our opportunity to have you upgrade. We now want you to be a 1,500-gallon grease trap.
1,500 gallons of grease.
15 times. It's the size of 3 parking spaces. It's much, much larger than you might expect. And then you think of hoods, right? You maybe turn on your hood over your range at home for a brief moment if you're cooking something like a bacon or pan searing something of this nature. But when you're making thousands of meals every day, you need a massive hood. And these things are crazy money. You could have $3,000 per linear foot very easily into hoods. And that's just in the construction part. That's not even the engineering and permits and certified air balance and whatnot. The kitchens are incredibly expensive to build. And again, your average restaurateur, that guy actually probably doesn't have the money or the skill set to construct these things by their nature. And so ultimately, restaurants can get so expensive to build that I believe the city of Marana, or the town, of Marana, it would behoove them to throw incentives towards landlords to create buildings that were befitting of a local restaurateur. I'm not saying TI it all the way out to where it's painted and it has its booths and tables and chairs. We expect to do those kind of interior remodels ourselves and budget for that. But to have the bones of it.
Great points, and I think repeatedly we've really kind of highlighted the challenges that go with opening a locally owned restaurant. So let me ask you this: do chain restaurateurs have these same kind of worries, these same kinds of challenges that, say, the locally owned restaurants do?
They certainly endure the same expenses, but they've got the economic capacity to endure a less than favorable return on that restaurant, often for many years. Upstart communities always want restaurants to come in. Not everybody wants a bar in their neighborhood, but everybody wants a nice restaurant, within walking distance or a short drive. But the thing is, like, we as local restaurateurs can't afford to live out the bad times until the town sort of matures and grows up around it. The Darden Restaurant Corporation, the Fox Restaurant Corporation, the Cheesecake Factory type things, these guys can afford to lose money for 2, 3, 4, 5 years before the investment turns the other way and starts to get profitable. But the average sole proprietor that literally has their life savings in this, right? Like, this is all chips in, like everything they have normally when they're going for a restaurant like this. Like, these guys can't afford to take like a negative return for 2 or 3 or 4 years. They often have debt service, right? They haven't paid for all of this in cash, and so there's some financing element. So you've got to take a business that is barely profitable on a good day and then sprinkle in a pile of debt on new equipment or a new build out, and suddenly you've got a recipe for a very risky return or no return at all on these. Years ago, when I moved back up to Tucson, I had restaurants in Mexico for a while, down in San Carlos, Sonora, Mexico, and I moved back to Tucson. I was really excited to open up Union, right? I had a couple decades of experience, a 47-page business plan, 7 figures in the bank, 0 debt, and a credit score that started with an 8. I walked into Wells Fargo and I was like, "Hi, my name's Grant Krueger. I'd like to get an SBA loan." And they went through my paperwork and saw all the neat things I just told you and were like, "This is great. This checks the box. This checks the box. Oh my, hospitality?" And I asked them why. I said, "Why? Like I have everything that you should, consider me a very viable candidate for a loan product." And they said, "Look, Grant, restaurants have such a high rate of failure and such low return if we have to liquidate them, and basically often refuse to lend on restaurateurs in general unless you're going to put your home equity, if you're fortunate enough in life to have home equity, up on the line as well too." So in many cases, you're not just putting your life savings out there, you're putting your home too. And if you fail, what's going to happen is the next restaurateur is going to come right behind you. They're going to put a coat of paint on your restaurant. They're going to scratch out the word Grant's. They're going to put in the word Terry's, right on top. And he's going to do it for a fraction of the price that I did. And so it's a chicken and egg argument that nobody wants to be the first one on the block. You almost kind of want to be the second and let the first fool put in the kitchens and the grease traps and the hoods, and then you let them fail, and then you take over. The real savvy restaurateurs, my buddy Ray Flores from El Charro Restaurants has made quite a living out of finding downtown spaces on their second or third generation so that the tenant improvement wasn't as expensive. That first build, and that a good portion of that risk likely is going to have to be borne by the landlords and not necessarily the restaurateur. If you're waiting to find sole proprietorship restaurateurs that have $2, $3, $4, $5 million to build from scratch, we could all be waiting.
We could be waiting a long time.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of Olive Gardens and Dutch Brothers here before we see establishments like that one pop up. So incentivizing the landlords in any way, shape, or form, be it through property taxes, be it through potentially parking as well too. I've had a real devil of a time over the last decade with various parking ordinances in the city of Tucson, of which I find to be outdated. The business model has changed. Not everybody drives to the restaurants. They all take Ubers. And Lyft. The whole world has changed.
Sure.
But our parking codes often haven't. And so they haven't caught up to the technology. And I want to segue into this before we run out of time, staffing. Terry, one of the things we need in a big restaurant is crew.
Yeah.
Just a place like Union.
I've heard that repeatedly as we've gone out and talked to various restaurateurs. That's the biggest struggle is staffing it.
One of the reasons I've stayed, I won't necessarily call it midtown, so to say, but at least in the urban core of Pima County, is the accessibility to staff, right? A little restaurant like Union's got 100 people. I've got, 225 souls or so that work for me right now. And the grand majority of them can't afford to live in the foothills or in big, new, beautiful single-family homes, on acreage or something in Marana. They often live in apartments, or they're students, and they ride bikes to work, or they take bus lines and things of this nature. If you're reducing yourself to destination only, like we're out far and you literally have to have a car to come work here, there's no other option for you except for automotive transport, you're eliminating, say 20%, 25% of the restaurant employees out there in the workforce, of a workforce that's already not that available right now to begin with. And so when I lose those people, there goes my entry-level workers. One of the things that I pride ourselves on as a restaurant group is giving people first, second, and third chances in life. We not only have a place where I have students, high school and college, working in their first job, I have guys and girls out of the penal system, right? Mm-hmm. Probably people you arrested many years ago, and you're in TPD. You're probably familiar with some of them if you came in the kitchen. But I say that not jokingly. I say that in a way that gives them an opportunity to start over and say, you know what? We've made a couple bad turns here or there in life, but it's not done for you. Come on in. I got a hot meal for you and a way to start making some money right away. Mm-hmm. We're happy to have you. Nights, weekends, holidays are our thing. You're free that time too. Perfect. Let's do it. And we provide employment to a lot of people that don't have a lot of other alternatives. And so having access to those staff members, physically to be able to be within, say, a few miles of where they work is very helpful. To assume that they all have working awesome automobiles to be able to bust up I-10 and make their way here might not be as easy as everybody thinks.
Yeah. And as I indicated just a minute or so ago, I've heard that repeatedly as I've talked with 3 or 4 different restaurateurs, and that is going to be a challenge for us, especially up here in the northern part where we're a little bit separated from the populace and certainly growing, but we're not there yet. So that's something that I was actually just talking to the mayor about that before I came down and started the podcast about how we can go about getting people, maybe even having our own shuttle service and whatnot. But just want to finish up with one thing. You know, if you're forecasting, all right, I want you to put on your best prognosticating hat here and predict what kinds of restaurants are going to be coming next for the town of Marana. You don't have to give necessarily names. If you have examples, that's fine. But what's going to be successful out of the gate to start the ball rolling to maybe get a Union Pub House or a Prep and Pastry or something like that in Marana.
On the local front, if you're looking for the types of full-service restaurants that have the most chance of succeeding in a new upstart environment, I would say you would be looking at both sports bar type restaurants and breakfast concepts, because they have the two things that restaurants need to survive, which is margin, right? Sports pubs make their margin, quite frankly, on beer.
Alcohol,
they often open with a restaurant liquor license and do a substantial food trade, right? Think of a Trident or something like that locally. They certainly have decent food and are a well-executed local little restaurant, but they have a bit of a bar component to it too. Some people might find that a little seedier, but the truth is that sprinkle of alcohol can help make the difference in a restaurant's financials to keep it around. And breakfast over the years too has had substantial growth, Terry. You see, like you mentioned, Aries Collective, right? Prep and Pastry.
Right.
But there are others, that I'm seeing grow regionally between Baja Cafe and between like Bisbee Breakfast Club and these type of groups where breakfast can kind of go into 2nd and 3rd, 4th generation spots. Eggs and coffee have pretty reasonable restaurant margins, and they can do pretty high volume because breakfast tends to be a lower price. And so it, by its nature, becomes a less expensive treat for the family than taking everybody out for a steak dinner. And so I think those two concepts are going to be the first ones you're going to see in Marana. When you look for fine dining, a lot of these things just don't even exist anymore in the wild outside of the cocoon of, say, a hotel restaurant supporting that. As you attract larger resort hotels, they'll often carry restaurants of the white tablecloth or near white tablecloth variety. But those things often wouldn't exist if they were a freestanding business. Only as part of the hotel environment where their bills are often picked up by corporations, Amex Black Cards and things, can they live their normal life. So I'm going to go with sports pubs and breakfast would be the two things I'd start with up front. And I would look into trying to create incentives to perhaps have them lumped somewhere close together. As much as we may look at it as competition between each other, Tucson's had great success over the years with Restaurant Row or concentrations of restaurants downtown or 4th Avenue. And even if they're
La Quintada has real success with the 4 or 5 restaurants they have.
But these kind of things can be fun, like to walk into an area that's vibrant with 5 or 6 restaurants and a bar or two, and they're all kind of bustling on the patio, and you kind of walk and choose, pick and choose between them. Maybe even hop between a couple of them, right? Dinner over here, but after dinner, drinks and dessert over there. Super neat. Like, that's a great experience. And so if you guys can create that in some capacity, I feel that it would be helpful to actually have a concentration of them. You certainly may be able to, again, find some shared parking too, so that you just don't have this massive sea of blacktop that just gives such a suburban look and feel to it and adds a little more authentic urban core to the place. So I think that would be helpful.
Love it. Well, Grant, so appreciate you spending some time here with us today. I know for me personally, spending some time with you last week with Amanda and with Kurt, picking your brain and getting a sense of what we need to do and where we need to go with this whole thing has been really helpful. Hoping that for our listeners today, it's been helpful as well. So thanks so much for joining us, and to our listeners, until next time. Submit your questions by visiting maranaaz.gov/realtalk, and we'll answer them right here. To receive notifications for new releases, remember to click subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please follow the town on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to stay up to date on current news and events.